August 7th, 1942. The sun had barely crested the horizon, spilling molten gold across the choppy waters of the Coral Sea. Smoke from distant naval engagements curled into the sky, a dark veil over the island of Guadalcanal. In this crucible of conflict, a formation of U.S. Navy F4F Wildcats screamed into the air from Henderson Field, their stubby frames silhouetted against the rising sun. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Thorne, gritting his teeth behind the canopy, felt the vibration of the Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines thrumming through his seat. Every motion of the stick felt like an extension of his own reflexes. Below, Japanese A6M Zeros carved elegant arcs through the sky, their green fuselages glinting in the sunlight. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Tanaka, soaring in a flight of 4, spotted the Wildcats and sneered through the wind. Easy prey today, he thought, banking sharply. The Wildcat, slower and heavier, seemed an obvious target, a flying brick compared to his sleek Zero. Yet, as he dived toward Thorne's tail, something in the American pilot's maneuver made him hesitate. Thorne felt the Zero closing in fast, its 20mm cannon spitting fire with deadly precision. With a sudden, almost violent twist of the control stick, he initiated a high-speed roll. The Wildcat's wings flexed and twisted, responding like a thoroughbred despite the plane's stout frame. In less than a second, the F4F had rotated completely, the Zero suddenly on the defensive, its guns missing by inches. Thorne's heart pounded as he pulled back on the stick, the Wildcat's rugged fuselage withstanding stresses that would have shredded lesser aircraft. The tables had turned in the blink of an eye. All around the sky, American pilots began experimenting with the Wildcat's secret advantage. Lieutenant Robert Hanson, a rookie barely out of flight school, had been diving to escape an enemy ace when he discovered that a rapid roll at full throttle allowed him to swing behind the pursuing Zero. Each dogfight became a frantic ballet of roll rates and vertical dives, the nimble Wildcats using their hidden trick to outmaneuver opponents who had underestimated them. The Zeros, designed for graceful, extended maneuvers, struggled to counter this abrupt, brutal technique. Back on the Japanese side, Tanaka radioed his flight leader in disbelief. They flipped their planes. How? The voice in his headset trembled, unaccustomed to seeing such raw, mechanical defiance of expectations. The Wildcat was supposed to be lumbering, slow, easy to crush. But here it was, twisting, rolling, and diving like a demon, impervious to what should have been fatal attacks. By mid-morning, over the forests and beaches of Guadalcanal, the pattern became clear. The Japanese pilots, expecting routine victories, found themselves losing altitude and position within seconds of engaging. Every encounter forced a new respect for the Stubby fighter. Even the most seasoned aces were caught off guard, their carefully honed tactics failing against a machine that had quietly concealed a lethal secret: the F4F's roll rate superiority. By late afternoon, the sky above Guadalcanal had become a chaotic lattice of tracers, smoke, and spinning aircraft. Lieutenant Thorne's squadron had already engaged 3 separate Zero patrols, and word spread quickly through the airwaves. The Wildcat had a trick no Japanese pilot had trained for. Thorne banked hard, his fingers white on the stick, and launched into another abrupt roll. In the moment of the turn, he felt the plane almost leap under him, a living creature obeying his command. Below, Tanaka's Zero tried to match the maneuver, but its long, slender wings faltered in the abrupt rotation. The Wildcats surged behind him, guns blazing. On the ground, mechanics and officers at Henderson Field watched anxiously as Wildcats took off and returned in bursts of victory and near disaster. Unlike the fragile Zeros, The F4Fs could absorb punishment. One returning aircraft bore the scars of multiple 20mm hits, yet still landed safely. The thick fuselage, the armored cockpit, and the rugged landing gear that could endure the harsh Guadalcanal airstrips gave pilots a confidence they had not expected. "These planes, they're tanks with wings," muttered Lieutenant Hanson. Wiping sweat from his brow, high above, the air combat grew more frenzied. Japanese pilots attempted their classic maneuvers, long, graceful spirals meant to trap opponents. But the Wildcat's abrupt roll rate broke every pattern. Lieutenant Tanaka, now sweating beneath his oxygen mask, found himself spiraling downward in panic as a Wildcat rolled beneath him and suddenly reversed position. His Zero's delicate structure groaned under the stress of trying to match the Wildcat's velocity in a roll. And for the first time, he realized that brute skill alone would not secure victory. The key, as American pilots quickly discovered, was timing. The roll had to be executed at speed, just as the Zero closed in, transforming a defensive dive into an offensive strike in a heartbeat. Lieutenant Thorne's eyes scanned the sky constantly, searching for the glint of green wings. And each engagement became a split-second chess game. One moment he was a hunted pilot, the next a predator. His .50 caliber machine guns punishing those who had underestimated the Wildcat's hidden edge. Stories of these encounters began to spread through the carrier decks and makeshift airfields of the South Pacific. Pilots recounted how the Stubby fighters rolled into enemy formations, then disappeared into the sun, only to reappear behind unsuspecting Zeros. The psychological impact on the Japanese was profound. They had trained to expect the Wildcat as a slow, ponderous target, and the sudden revelation of its agility threw them into confusion, hesitation, and even panic. By the end of the first week of fighting over Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea, the Wildcat had proven itself not merely a defensive aircraft, but a cunning predator capable of turning its weaknesses into weapons. The myth of the Zero's invincibility began to crack. Across radio channels, Japanese aces muttered in disbelief about American planes that could defy expectations. Planes that laughed at speed and finesse and instead relied on cunning, steel, and a hidden secret: the sudden, lethal roll. May 8, 1942. The open expanse of the Coral Sea shimmered under a relentless sun. From the decks of the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, Wildcats roared into the sky, their engines thundering over the waves, smoke from earlier airstrikes still hanging in the air. Lieutenant Commander John "Jack" Reynolds led his division with a steely calm, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar green flashes of A6M Zero wings. He had fought in the first skirmishes of the campaign and already knew the Wildcat's secret. When pushed to its limit, it could roll faster than any Zero, twisting the battlefield in an instant. As Reynolds spotted a flight of 6 Zeros diving toward a squadron of bombers, he signaled his men, "Watch your angles. Roll early, roll fast." In unison, the Wildcats began a series of abrupt, high-speed rolls. The Zeros, expecting the American planes to dive predictably, found themselves suddenly out of position. Lieutenant Reynolds twisted sharply, feeling the wings strain against the forces of physics, then leveled out directly behind Lieutenant Hiroshi Saito, whose eyes widened in disbelief. The Wildcat's guns barked, and Saito's Zero was forced into evasive maneuvers, trailing smoke from near misses. The Coral Sea battles became a masterclass in improvisation and exploitation of aircraft strengths. Unlike the Zero, which relied on sustained agility in long, sweeping turns, the Wildcat thrived in explosive, short bursts of motion. Its abrupt roll rate allowed pilots to switch from defense to offense almost instantaneously. Lieutenant Hanson, now fully confident in his aircraft's capabilities, executed a series of rolling dives that left a pursuing Zero tumbling past him, its pilot gasping for control. The sky seemed to bend under the Wildcat's newfound tactics. But it wasn't just the roll rate that unnerved Japanese pilots. It was the Wildcat's ruggedness. Pilots dove steeply, pulling hard rolls, and the aircraft shrugged off stress that would have snapped a Zero's wings. One after another, American pilots discovered that they could push their planes far beyond what conventional wisdom had deemed safe. "You can push her like a stallion," muttered Thorne over the radio, a hint of exhilaration in his voice. And the Japanese were watching, shocked, as the so-called Stubby fighter refused to break under conditions that would have destroyed lesser planes. By mid-morning, the narrative of the battle had shifted. Japanese pilots had begun to hesitate, second-guessing their traditional dogfighting tactics. The Wildcat had turned what should have been easy kills into a lethal puzzle. Every attempted interception risked disaster as the Americans exploited the roll's sudden advantage. Lieutenant Tanaka, retreating after yet another near miss, admitted silently what every Japanese pilot was coming to understand. The F4F, though slower and heavier, could outmaneuver them in ways that no classroom or simulator could have predicted. As the Coral Sea engagement drew on, Wildcat pilots grew increasingly aggressive, their confidence bolstered by repeated successes. Each roll, each abrupt twist, reinforced a simple truth. Agility wasn't always about finesse or speed. Sometimes it was about exploiting hidden potential, leveraging structural toughness, and surprising the enemy when they least expected it. The Wildcat had transformed from a perceived liability into a cunning predator, and the lessons learned over the Coral Sea would echo in every dogfight that followed. August 12, 1942. Guadalcanal's jungles smoldered from artillery strikes, and the air above the island was alive with the shrill roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns. Lieutenant Thorne climbed to 12,000 feet, the canopy hot against his skin, beads of sweat running down his temple. Below, a formation of Zeros hunched their wings and dove, engines screaming, expecting the easy kill that had eluded them in the Coral Sea. The Wildcat, however, had learned its own lesson. Survival depended on exploiting every ounce of its hidden agility. Thorne executed a sudden roll, almost violent in its abruptness, and felt the plane respond like a living animal. The pursuing Zero overshot, unable to counter the high-speed rotation. Guns blazing, Thorne fired short bursts, scoring hits on the enemy's fuselage. Smoke trailed from the stricken aircraft as it spiraled downward. An enemy ace brought low, not by speed or superior firepower, but by cunning and a mastery of the Wildcat's secret advantage. Around him, the squadron executed similar maneuvers. Their movements synchronized like a deadly dance choreographed in midair. The Japanese pilots, meanwhile, began adapting, slowly, reluctantly. Lieutenant Tanaka had watched his comrades fall prey to the abrupt rolls of the Wildcats and realized that traditional dogfighting tactics were insufficient. He tried sharp dives and energy retention maneuvers, but the F4F's high roll rate allowed them to reverse positions faster than the Zeros could react. Every miscalculation became fatal. Even seasoned Japanese aces, confident in years of combat experience, were forced to retreat or risk annihilation. The Wildcat's ruggedness became equally important. Pilots could dive at extreme angles, pull out of rolls at breakneck speeds, and survive hits that would have shredded a Zero. Lieutenant Hanson, returning from a sortie, recounted how his aircraft had absorbed 4 direct hits, yet returned safely to Henderson Field. The ground crews marveled at the damage. Punctured wings, scorched fuselage. But the plane itself had held together, allowing its pilot to fight another day. "It's not just the rolls," he told a fellow pilot. "It's that this plane can take what the enemy throws and still fight back." As the campaign dragged on, the psychological toll on the Japanese pilots grew heavier. What they had once assumed to be a slow, ponderous aircraft was now a lethal adversary with a hidden edge they could neither anticipate nor counter quickly. Their confidence shattered in the skies above Guadalcanal, and hesitation crept into every maneuver. Meanwhile, American pilots, emboldened by their aircraft's surprising capabilities, learned to use the roll not merely as a defensive tactic, but as a tool of aggression, turning defense into instantaneous attack with terrifying efficiency. By late August, the narrative had shifted entirely. The F4F Wildcat had cemented its reputation not as a lumbering nuisance, but as a cunning, resilient predator. Japanese pilots no longer laughed at the Stubby fighter. Instead, they respected and feared its abrupt roll, its rugged frame, and the skill of the pilots who had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected trick could turn the tide of battle in a heartbeat. September 3rd, 1942. Early morning light filtered through low clouds above Guadalcanal, casting long shadows over the dense jungle canopy. Lieutenant Commander Jack Reynolds led a patrol of 6 Wildcats on a routine sweep, the distant rumble of naval guns echoing from the beaches. The Japanese, still reeling from repeated encounters with the Wildcat's secret, scrambled a flight of Zeros to intercept. Among them, Lieutenant Saito's hands were tight on the stick, his mind racing. He had seen firsthand how a Wildcat could twist out of death in a heartbeat. Reynolds spotted the incoming aircraft and barked over the radio. "Prepare to roll on my mark. Watch the wings. Tight, fast, aggressive." The squadron tensed, every muscle coiled for the instant maneuver that could save or end their lives. As the Zeros closed in, the Wildcats executed the roll with breathtaking precision. In the span of a second, they were behind their pursuers. Saito's heart sank as the tracer rounds zipped past, scoring fatal hits on 2 of his comrades. The battlefield had flipped, the Predator now in complete control. The encounters over Guadalcanal revealed another hidden lesson. The Wildcat's advantage wasn't just mechanical. It was tactical, psychological, and brutal. Japanese pilots, trained to expect traditional turns and dives, struggled to adapt to the abrupt unpredictability of the F4F. Even aces with years of combat experience found themselves outmaneuvered by what they had dismissed as a slow, unwieldy fighter. Lieutenant Tanaka's squadron commander radioed in frustration. "These Americans. This isn't a plane. It's a devil." Meanwhile, American pilots began to refine their techniques. The roll became more than a desperate evasive maneuver. It became an offensive tool. Wildcats engaged enemy formations with confidence, using rapid rolls and high-speed dives to disrupt attacks, reverse positions, and unleash devastating counterfire. Lieutenant Hanson, now regarded as an expert in the tactic, executed a double roll on a Zero attempting to flank him, emerging directly on its 6 o'clock position. One well-placed burst ended the engagement in seconds. The Japanese command, initially dismissive of reports from the front, began to take notice. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was cracking under the relentless pressure of the Wildcat's hidden edge. Intelligence reports began to circulate. American pilots had discovered a maneuver that exploited the Zero's structural and tactical limitations, one that could not be countered without rethinking dogfighting doctrine entirely. The psychological advantage shifted. Where once the Japanese dominated, now they approached every engagement with caution, wary of the abrupt, lethal roll that had become the Wildcat's signature move. By the end of the first month of sustained combat over Guadalcanal, it was clear that the F4F Wildcat was no longer the underdog in the skies. Its speed and agility might not have matched the Zero in long, drawn-out turns, but its roll rate trick, rugged construction, and the cunning of its pilots had transformed it into a predator, capable of punishing overconfidence, reversing fortunes, and reshaping air combat in the Pacific. By October 1942, the story of the F4F Wildcat's hidden roll rate trick had spread from Guadalcanal to every carrier deck in the Pacific. Pilots returning from missions spoke of how the seemingly stubby fighters had outsmarted, outrolled, and outlasted their Japanese pursuers. Lieutenant Thorne, now slightly battle-worn but exhilarated, recounted one encounter where a Zero had come screaming from above, only to find itself inverted, its guns spitting fire uselessly as the Wildcat rolled neatly beneath and behind it. "They thought speed made them untouchable," he muttered. "But sometimes all you need is a twist." The Japanese, meanwhile, studied reports and post-mission debriefs with a growing sense of unease. The Zero had dominated early war skies because pilots relied on its long, graceful turns, energy retention, and superior maneuverability in sustained dogfights. Yet the Wildcat forced them to confront a new reality. Raw agility could come in unexpected forms. The abrupt roll, combined with the aircraft's ruggedness and the pilot's timing, had created a tactical weapon that upended conventional wisdom. Experienced aces had fallen not because of superior firepower or training, but because they underestimated the Wildcat. Naval officers on both sides began to take note of the broader implications. The F4F's high-speed roll allowed American squadrons to shift from defensive to offensive in a heartbeat, preserving aircraft and lives while frustrating enemy pilots. The Wildcat's structural integrity under stress meant that daring maneuvers, previously considered dangerous or suicidal, became viable strategies. For Japanese commanders, it was a bitter lesson. The underdog could fight back, adapt, and even dominate when technology was matched with cunning tactics. Stories from the airfields reflected the changing attitude. Ground crews admired the Wildcat's resilience. Pilots grew bold in their attacks. Lieutenant Hanson recalled walking past a Wildcat fresh from combat, noting how its wings bore multiple bullet holes, yet remained perfectly functional. "You could almost feel the plane saying, 'Not today,'" he joked. That confidence translated into aggressiveness in the air, allowing American pilots to push further, fight smarter, and use the Wildcat's secret to maximum effect. By the end of 1942, the hidden roll rate advantage of the F4F Wildcat had permanently altered the dynamics of air combat in the Pacific. No longer was the Japanese Zero assumed to be invincible. The Wildcat had earned a reputation for cunning, toughness, and unpredictability. Pilots who once laughed at its stubby frame now respected it, and sometimes, quietly, even feared it. Its legacy was not just measured in aircraft downed, but in the psychological edge it gave American pilots. The knowledge that, in the right hands, a small twist of fate, a rapid roll, could turn the tide of battle in a single heartbeat.